In less than 5 years, both founders of the largest Christian television empire in America are dead, both in their mid-60s, both surrounded by unanswered questions. And when the second one died, her own son found out from a lawyer. This is Daystar Television Network. 64 million American homes, hundreds of millions of dollars, 4 decades of faith and devotion. And right now, thousands of its most loyal viewers are refusing to watch the funeral. Who is really in control of this empire? What happened inside those walls in the final years? And what does a ministry owe the people who built it with their trust? To understand how it all collapsed, we need to go back to where it began. To understand how far Daystar has fallen, you first have to understand how extraordinary it was that it ever existed at all. Marcus Lamb and Joni Lamb did not come from money. They did not inherit a media empire or receive a check from a wealthy denomination. They met at a small church in Greenville, South Carolina, where Marcus had come to preach during a revival. Joni was in the congregation. She was young, quietly determined, and carried a faith that felt less like religion and more like a consuming fire. They married in 1982, and almost immediately, they hit the road together as traveling evangelists, visiting churches, preaching in small towns, living out of suitcases, and trusting that something larger was waiting for them on the other side of obedience. That something arrived in 1984, when the couple settled in Montgomery, Alabama, and made a decision that most people in their position would have considered reckless. They purchased a full-power television station, not a cable slot, not a late-night infomercial block, an actual broadcast television station on the air, reaching real homes. The station was called WMCF-TV, Channel 45, and it became their first pulpit with a transmitter. For 6 years, Marcus and Joni taught the Bible on television in Alabama. They were not polished. They were not backed by a network. They were 2 young believers with a camera, a conviction, and a willingness to do whatever it took to keep the signal alive. When they finally sold the station in 1990 and moved to Dallas, Texas, chasing a larger market and a bigger vision, they carried nothing but that same stubborn faith and the lessons learned from 6 years of building something from zero. Dallas tested them. Starting over in a major market meant starting at the bottom again. But by 1993, Marcus and Joni had raised enough money to purchase a defunct television station, KMPX-TV, Channel 29. It was not glamorous. It was a gutted shell of a broadcast operation sitting in the middle of a city that had no particular reason to pay attention to 2 evangelists from Alabama. But they went on the air anyway. 5 years later, they renamed it Daystar Television Network. What followed was one of the most remarkable growth stories in the history of Christian broadcasting. Through relentless fundraising, aggressive satellite expansion, and a programming vision that combined preaching, worship music, talk shows, and global missions content, Daystar grew from a single Dallas station into a worldwide operation. By the peak of its reach, the network was available in over 64 million American homes, surpassing even the legendary Trinity Broadcasting Network in household reach. Internationally, Daystar's signal covered parts of Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, carrying the gospel and the Lamb family brand to corners of the world that a small church in Greenville, South Carolina, could never have imagined. Joni became the warm, approachable face of the network through her daily program, Joni Table Talk, a round-table conversation show that blended faith, culture, and current events with guests ranging from prominent pastors to Christian celebrities. Marcus anchored the flagship program, Ministry Now, which the couple co-hosted for years as the most visible symbol of their partnership. Together, they were the Daystar brand. Their marriage was the story the network sold to its audience every single day. Two people called by God, walking in unity, building something eternal. The financial scale of what they built was staggering. Because Daystar operates under the umbrella of the Word of God Fellowship Church, it is not required to file a public IRS Form 990, which means its full finances remain shielded from public scrutiny. But industry estimates place the value of the operation in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The network's International Ministry Center, headquartered in Bedford, Texas, between Dallas and Fort Worth, became a landmark in the region. It was not just a television studio, it was a campus, a symbol of everything Marcus and Joni had built with their own hands over 4 decades of relentless work. To their audience, millions of older, deeply faithful American Christians who had watched them every day for years, Marcus and Joni Lamb were not celebrities. They were family. They were the couple you invited into your living room every morning over coffee. They were the voices that prayed with you through illness, through grief, through uncertainty. They were, in the eyes of their most devoted viewers, the living proof that faith and faithfulness could build something that lasted. That trust was the most valuable asset Daystar ever owned, and it was about to be destroyed. It did not collapse all at once. Empires rarely do. What happened to Daystar happened the way a foundation cracks. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, and then suddenly all at once, in ways that cannot be repaired with prayer alone. The first crack arrived in the middle of a global pandemic. When COVID-19 swept across the United States in 2020 and 2021, most major television networks, including Christian ones, found themselves navigating an impossible moment. People were frightened. People were dying. And the public was desperate for voices of clarity and comfort. Marcus Lamb chose a different path. From his platform at Daystar, one of the most watched Christian networks in the country, Marcus became one of the loudest and most aggressive voices against the COVID-19 vaccine. Week after week, he used the network's airwaves to cast doubt on the safety of the vaccines, to promote alternative treatments including hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and to frame the entire public health effort as something the faithful should resist. His audience, largely older, deeply trusting, and conditioned to receive his words as spiritual guidance, listened. Then, in November of 2021, Marcus Lamb contracted COVID-19. He did not recover. On November 23, 2021, Marcus Lamb died at the age of 64 from severe complications of the very virus he had spent months telling his audience was manageable without vaccines. He had reportedly attempted to treat himself using the same alternative methods he had promoted on his own network. The news landed like a thunderclap across the Christian broadcasting world. The reaction from the public was immediate and deeply divided. His devoted followers mourned him as a man of God who had been taken too soon. But a significant portion of the broader public, including many Christians who had watched the network's vaccine messaging with growing alarm, saw something else entirely. They saw a man who had used a global platform to steer vulnerable people away from medical protection, and who had then become a casualty of his own message. The family's response only deepened the controversy. Rather than acknowledging the painful irony of what had happened, Daystar went on the air and declared that Marcus had not died from the disease itself, but had been the victim of a spiritual attack, that the enemy had targeted him specifically because of his powerful voice for the gospel. To true believers, that framing offered comfort. To the outside world, and to a growing number of disillusioned former viewers, it felt like the network was refusing to face reality, in the same way it had refused to face the science of the pandemic. The first face of Daystar was gone, and the way he died and the way his death was explained had already begun to erode the trust that took 40 years to build. Joni Lamb stepped into the void. She assumed full leadership of the network, took on the presidency, and made it clear that Daystar would continue. In many ways, her resilience in those early months was genuine and visible. She appeared on air, she addressed her audience with vulnerability, she leaned into her faith publicly. For a period, the sympathy of her viewers carried her through. Losing a husband and a ministry partner of nearly 4 decades is not something anyone navigates easily, and the audience recognized that. But then came 2023, and with it, the second crack, the one that split the foundation far deeper than the first. Less than 2 years after Marcus's death, Joni Lamb announced that she was getting married again. Her new husband was Dr. Doug Weiss, a psychologist, author, and frequent guest on Daystar programming. The announcement sent an immediate shockwave through the network's viewer base. For a deeply conservative Christian audience, remarriage after the death of a spouse is not automatically controversial, but the speed of it, less than 24 months after Marcus had been buried, felt to many longtime viewers like a betrayal of everything the network had represented. The controversy did not stop at discomfort. Joni's own son, Joni Lamb, who had served as a vice president of the network, publicly opposed the marriage on biblical grounds. His argument was specific and pointed. He contended that Doug Weiss had not divorced his previous wife on grounds that their faith tradition would consider biblically valid, which in his view made Joni's marriage to him spiritually illegitimate. It was not a quiet family disagreement settled behind closed doors. It became public, and what followed turned into one of the most painful and public family ruptures in the history of American Christian broadcasting. Joni was fired from the network. The official explanation from Joni and Daystar was that his termination followed a 15-month review of his job performance, and that he had been fabricating a smear campaign against the ministry. Joni and his wife Susie told a very different story. They alleged that Joni and the network leadership had covered up a deeply serious matter involving the alleged sexual abuse of their daughter by a male relative. A Texas police department investigated the allegations and ultimately closed the case in May of 2025, citing insufficient evidence. But the damage to the family's public image was irreversible. High-profile Christian figures began to distance themselves from Daystar. Joyce Meyer, one of the most prominent voices in Christian television and a longtime presence on the network, quietly stepped back. Other preachers followed. The audience that had once flooded Daystar with donations and loyalty began to fragment. Online forums, social media threads, and YouTube channels devoted to Christian ministry accountability filled with thousands of comments from former viewers describing why they had stopped watching and stopped giving. The network that had been built on the image of a united, faithful, spiritually grounded family was now visibly, publicly, and painfully fractured. And Joni herself was changing. Those who watched her on screen in 2024 and 2025 noticed something was different. Her appearance had shifted in ways that prompted concern rather than the casual commentary that always follows public figures. Viewers described what looked like significant weight changes, occasional slurring, and a physical heaviness that did not match the sharp, energetic woman they had watched for decades. Doug Weiss appeared on the network in the weeks before her death to explain that she had been off the air due to 2 hairline fractures in her spine. But online communities were already asking questions that went well beyond a back injury. Then came May 7, 2026. Daystar announced that Joni Lamb had died. She was 65 years old. The official statement said she had been dealing with serious private health challenges for some time and that a recent back injury had compounded those challenges and led to a more serious medical situation. The Wikipedia entry for Joni Lamb, updated in the hours after her death, listed the cause as complications from metastatic bone cancer alongside the spinal injury. but the family and the network did not publicly confirm that diagnosis in their official communications, leaving a cloud of ambiguity over the exact circumstances of her final months. What happened next made everything worse. Jonathan Lamb and his wife Susie publicly stated that they had not been informed of Joni's deteriorating condition by any family member. They learned of her death not from a sister, not from Doug Weiss, not from anyone inside the home, but from a Daystar attorney. The son of the woman who built this empire from nothing was told his mother had died by a lawyer. That detail spread across social media within hours, and for thousands of viewers who had already been watching the Lamb family's public disintegration with grief and disbelief, it became the moment that confirmed what many had quietly feared. That somewhere between the scandal of the remarriage, the firing of the son, the allegations that were never fully resolved, and the death that arrived wrapped in silence and legal intermediaries, the family at the center of Daystar had stopped being a family at all. Joyce Meyer had already distanced herself. Jonathan was already gone. The leadership team that Daystar announced was now in place had not been named publicly. And the man standing at the center of what remained, Doug Weiss, Joni's husband of less than 3 years, was now, in the eyes of a significant portion of the audience, the most controversial figure in Christian television. Viewers who had donated for decades began posting on social media that they would not watch the funeral. Not because they did not grieve Joni. Many of them did, deeply and genuinely, but because watching meant participating in a ceremony controlled by the same forces they believed had fractured the family, silenced the son, and left too many questions permanently unanswered. The boycott was not organized. There was no petition, no coordinated campaign. It was simply thousands of individuals making the same quiet, heartbroken decision at the same time. They had given Daystar their trust for 30 years, and they felt in the end that it had not been returned. There is a particular kind of grief that has no clean name. It is not the grief of losing someone you loved unconditionally. It is not the grief of a stranger's passing that you read about in a headline and forget by afternoon. It is the grief of losing someone you trusted, someone whose voice was woven into the fabric of your daily life for decades, and discovering, only at the end, that the story you were told was never quite complete. That is the grief that tens of thousands of Daystar viewers are sitting with right now. They are not grieving only Joni Lamb. They are grieving the version of Joni Lamb they believed in. The woman who sat across the table from guests every morning, who laughed openly, who prayed without embarrassment, who built something alongside her husband that felt, from the outside, like living proof that faith could anchor a life against any storm. That woman was real. Her work was real. The 40 years she poured into that network were real. But so was everything else. So was the husband who told millions of vulnerable Americans to resist a vaccine and then died from the virus that vaccine was designed to fight. So was the remarriage that arrived so quickly it left her own son standing outside the door of his family's ministry, publicly opposed and ultimately fired. So were the allegations that circled the family for 2 years without resolution. So was the son who found out his mother was dead from an attorney. So was the unnamed leadership team now quietly assuming control of an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with no public explanation of who they are or what direction they intend to take. And so is the question that nobody inside Daystar has answered. Who runs this now? Joni worked with the board before her death to ensure an executive leadership team was in place, the network's statement said. Those were the exact words. Executive leadership team. No names, no faces, no voices stepping forward to address the audience that built this ministry with 30 years of donations and devotion. Jonathan Lamb the one person who carries the actual bloodline of both founders, the son of Marcus and Joni, the man who grew up inside these walls, is not expected to return. The rift between him and the current administration has been described by those close to the situation as beyond repair. What that leaves is a network reaching 64 million American homes, generating revenue that its church structure keeps permanently shielded from public view. Now operating under the guidance of people whose names the audience does not know, in the wake of two founders dead before the age of 66, with a family so fractured that the son learned of his mother's death from a lawyer. In the world of megachurches and Christian media empires, this kind of collapse is not entirely without precedent. Large ministries built around a single personality or a single couple have stumbled before. But what makes the Daystar story different? What makes it land with such particular weight on the audience that loved it most? Is the speed of it all. Marcus and Joni Lamb were not elderly. They were not winding down. Marcus was 64. Joni was 65. In a world where prominent ministry leaders like Billy Graham preached into their 70s and 80s, where televangelists routinely appear on screen well past 90, losing both founders of the same empire within 5 years, both in their mid-60s, both under circumstances that generated far more questions than answers, feels to many of their viewers like something that defies ordinary explanation. That is why the word curse found its way into the conversation. Not because the people using it necessarily believe in a literal supernatural punishment, but because the human mind, when confronted with a pattern of loss that feels too concentrated and too swift to be random, reaches for a word that captures the weight of it. Curse, collapse, judgment. The vocabulary changes depending on who is speaking. The feeling underneath is the same. Something broke here, and it broke fast. And nobody in a position of authority has fully explained why. For the viewers who are boycotting the funeral, the decision is not about anger at Joni herself. Most of them will tell you, if you read their comments and their posts, that they loved her, that they prayed for her, that they are genuinely sad she is gone. What they cannot accept is the performance of unity at a ceremony presided over by the same circumstances they believe divided the family. They cannot watch Doug Weiss stand at a podium and grieve publicly for a woman whose son he allegedly kept at a distance in her final days. They cannot watch daughters who may or may not have known their brother was being excluded offer eulogies about faith and family. They cannot sit through a tribute to a ministry whose finances remain hidden, whose next leaders remain unnamed, and whose most painful chapter remains officially unacknowledged. So, they are staying home. They are grieving in private. They are grieving the Joni they knew from the screen, before the cracks became visible, before the remarriage, before the firing, before the attorney's phone call. And they are asking, quietly, the question that this entire story has been building toward. What does a ministry owe the people who built it with their trust? Daystar was not funded by corporations or government grants. It was funded by ordinary people. Retirees in Ohio sending monthly checks, widows in Georgia staying up late to call in during pledge drives, families in Texas who chose Daystar over Trinity Broadcasting, over every other option, because Marcus and Joni felt like the real thing. Those people are still out there. They are still watching. They are still waiting for someone inside that network to look directly into the camera and speak to them with the same honesty they were promised for 4 decades. That moment has not come yet. Whether it ever does will determine whether Daystar survives this. Empires can outlast their founders, institutions can rebuild after scandal. But trust, once broken in the particular way it has been broken here, does not return simply because the cameras keep rolling and the programming continues as scheduled. Marcus Lamb built something extraordinary. Joni Lamb sustained it through grief and carried it forward when she had every reason to step away. Whatever happened in the final chapter, whatever decisions were made, whatever truths were kept private, whatever wounds were left unhealed, that foundation was real, and it mattered to millions of people. But foundations are only as strong as the honesty built on top of them. And right now, the people who loved Daystar most are standing outside the funeral of its last founder, asking to be let back in, not to the building, but to the truth. Whether anyone inside is listening is the only question that still matters. If this story moved you, leave a comment below telling us what you remember most about Daystar. Subscribe for more untold stories behind the empires the world thought were unbreakable. Because sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones that teach us the most about what faith, family, and trust really cost.